Well, for more on the outlook of the retail industry, our Karina caught up with the head of the National Retail Federation, Matthew Shay. Now, the NRF just wrapped its annual conference in New York, bringing together thousands of people working in the industry. And Karina asked him about what major retailers prioritize in their businesses.
I think the things that are getting talked about here this week really are a couple of categories. One is, how do you make the digital more like the store experience, as opposed to the other way around? It's not turning a store into a digital experience, it's turning the digital more into a store experience where it's really immersive and you feel connected. The other is really using stores as an asset for distribution, as a competitive advantage, as part of the distribution supply chain, and making it more convenient and more cost-effective for customers in that regard.
Retailers are all trying to figure out how to harness innovation to basically stay relevant in the digital age. What kind of technologies are you seeing them invest in right now?
What we've seen and heard a lot about here, and it's going on behind us and all around us, is investment in artificial intelligence and in machine learning and in the kinds of technologies that enable a more efficient way of engaging with consumers. You know, I mentioned a little bit ago that I think one of the things that's changed is what we've seen here today and this week is different from 4 or 5 years ago when everyone was thinking, how do we make a store more of a digital experience? And now it's how do we make the digital experience more like a store?
Corporate earnings season is about to kick off. Now, you work for the National Retail Federation. Obviously, there's a slight bias to be bullish on retail stocks, but how do you think they're going to fare in the latest season?
Retail sales in October grew by more than 4% and in November by more than 5%. So our forecast was for growth over the holidays of 4.3 to 4.8%, and we feel like we're poised to do that. We'd like to be able to tell you definitively that that's the case, but since the federal government is closed, the Department of Commerce is closed, and we don't have our numbers, and we can't report. So we'll report those hopefully as soon as the government gets opened, which we believe and hope will be shortly. So I think everything's in place for us to see another strong year in 2019, and I think that across the board earnings should reflect that.
You mentioned the government shutdown. How is that impacting the retail industry?
I think up to this point, in spite of the fact that there are hundreds of thousands of Americans, I think, unfairly impacted by this because we're asking them to go to work, but we're not going to pay them. I think there's a real issue there. But I think the economy hasn't begun to suffer any real consequences yet, but shortly it will, and I think we should all be concerned about that.
The U.S. Federal Reserve recently cut its outlook expectations for the U.S. economy in 2019 to 2.3% growth. At the same time, China's economy is slowing down. These are the world's 2 largest consumer markets showing signs of weakness. How is the retail industry reacting?
Even if it slows to 6.5% this year in China, given the size of their economy, that's massive growth, and they're making a big transformation from an economy that's led by investment to an economy led by consumption. So, I don't think we should overstate the negative consequences for the Chinese economy. And similarly, I think in the U.S., if we go from 3.5% to 3 or 2.8 or 2.9 or 2.5, that's still real growth in a meaningful way on an increasing base. And I think we can certainly withstand that. So no one that I've talked to, including Federal Reserve Chair Yellen, has said definitively we can predict a real negative downturn, a recession. I think there's a sense that it may not stay this hot forever, but even if we did 2.5%, that would still be a very strong environment.
What about trade tensions between the U.S. and China? We've seen some items already being slapped with tariffs. There is the worry that we might see an increase in those tariffs in March. How is the retail industry adjusting to this potential?
Retailers, as a number of CEOs have said, have a lot of levers to pull in terms of thinking about how they're going to address this if it continues to be an issue or becomes a more acute issue. Whether that's diversifying the supply chain or working with their partners or adjusting their product or their pricing mix. So it's not as if they're without abilities in an environment in which this happens. We've been pleased that in spite of the rhetoric on tariffs, that the administration and policymakers in Washington seem to recognize the negative consequences for the economy when it comes to putting tariffs on consumer goods. They recognize the economy in the United States is driven by consumption. 70% of that is by consumers. You raise prices and you put a tariff in place. That tariff, I think we got to be clear on this, Karina. A tariff is a tax on U.S. consumers, right? A tariff is not going to impact the country in which that good is manufactured. You put a tariff on a good and you pay it here in this country when you purchase it. And that's counterproductive. We certainly agree with the administration's goals that the Chinese are engaged in some unfair trading practices, whether it's intellectual property theft or technology transfer, any number of things. But getting into a trade war is the wrong way to do it because we're only hurting ourselves.
You say the Trump administration seems to recognize that it wouldn't be wise to put tariffs on consumer items, yet some consumer items have already been hit. And if he does go through with his threats, every item from China would face tariffs. He's also proven to be rather unpredictable. So given that, how can you be sure consumer items won't be facing tariffs?
I wouldn't say that it's definitely going to be exempt, but I do think that there's a recognition that there are real downsides for both economies. And, you think about the old Thai proverb that when the elephants fight, the grass gets trampled. And in this case, if the Chinese and the United States get into a fight on trade policy, consumers, and that means voters and working class Americans, are going to be harmed. And we've already seen some of that. We know that in parts of this country, manufacturing facilities are being negatively impacted. We know farmers and ranchers and the agricultural community is already negatively impacted. So we can only go so far sort of pushing the other side before this boomerangs back on us. And I think there's an awareness of that and a desire to sit down and get back to the table and make some progress. We've got to find a way to do it in which both sides feel satisfied that they got enough to go back and say we made progress.